and welcome to GradCast, the official radio show and podcast for the Society of Graduate Students here at Western University. I'm your host, Ariel Frame.
And I'm your co-host, Liam Clifford.
Today we have a guest from the political science program doing his PhD, John Trafford. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It's good to have you, John. John's a good friend of mine for everyone listening. And I mean, I know you quite well, John, but do you just want to explain to our audience and Ariel just a little bit about yourself and why you chose to come to Western?
Certainly. So my journey to Western was kind of an odd one. I actually have two master's degrees. I finished a master's in history from the University of Victoria. I finished at an awkward time, right around Christmas. I ended up going home to New Brunswick for a few months, and I was working in a potato chip factory, and I thought, this really sucks. So I tossed in some random applications to a few universities, and Western just seemed like the best fit for me. And I'm very fortunate because it's almost like the stars aligned to bring me to Western and to help me find a supervisor so that I can study something that I think is very important. So it was kind of a roundabout way that I got to Western, but I'm actually really glad that I ended up here.
You know, I read articles now. I even saw one yesterday that said, oh, here's some number of reasons why you should take a break between your undergrad and your graduate school. And so apparently it builds character, or it helps develop your mind to do something else and take a step out of academia. So maybe that experience in the chip factory was valuable and
yeah,
in some ways,
Well, it was valuable. It taught me what I don't want to do for the rest of my life. And it taught me the value of a hard day's work. And it also it made me appreciate, this is a different topic, I guess, but it made me appreciate leftist politics and just what the working class sacrifices. The only reason I'm able to live in this ivory tower kind of environment is because we have people paving the roads, people fixing the showers, people, everything that we have is because of the working class. And I'm really glad I ended up in that job. So anyway.
Wow. I did not see that connection coming, but maybe towards the end of the podcast we'll talk about how we seize the means of production. But why don't we dig right into your current PhD work?
Sure.
I'm really interested to know what you're working on.
Okay, so I guess to kind of illustrate sort of the universe that my thinking takes place in, I guess what fascinates me so much, I'm a very peaceful person. It takes me quite a bit to get angry. I think I was in a fight one time in grade 9, and that was about it. So I've always been kind of fascinated, but looking at what would drive someone to violence, and not just violence, but mass killing, mass slaughter. What on earth could make someone want to do that, and not only want to do it, but think it's a good idea? And so that drew me to the study of the Rwandan Genocide, which is what I focused on in my master's here at Western. I wrote my master's research paper on the Rwandan Genocide. And and I think for the listeners, what I'd like to highlight about my area of interest with the Rwandan Genocide, the key thing that we need to understand about this, it took place about 12 weeks in the spring and early summer of 1994. And at its height, it had a rate of killing that was about 5 times the Holocaust. And of course, We're all familiar with the Holocaust was an industrialized genocide, whereas the Rwandan genocide wasn't, you wouldn't call it deindustrialized, it was non-industrialized. So it was done with simple tools, machetes, farm equipment, yet they achieved a killing rate 5 times higher than the Nazis. And I wonder, that put me onto a train of thinking that has kind of informed everything else that I do in political science. If that illustrates what you were asking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, just stating those statistics off the bat is such an incredible way to get someone hooked on wanting to learn more about how, you know, something so abhorrent and awful, you know, I could think of so many awful adjectives to use to describe it, happened. So do you mind giving our listeners a bit of a Cole's Note version as to how the killing took place in Rwanda, perhaps what the catalyst was, and how it eventually ended?
Yeah, and so to answer your question, Liam, I'll give you a quick Cole's Notes 20th century history of Rwanda, like 1 minute, because it's really, and the reason I do that is not to not to demonstrate my historical knowledge, but I believe, and I think this is true within most of the literature, you must take a historical perspective if you're going to understand the Rwandan genocide. And the reason for that is we need to look at the nature of colonialism in Rwanda and how colonialism sort of not created, but solidified the idea of ethnic identity. So in the Rwandan genocide, essentially what had occurred, there were two major ethnic groups. There's a third, the Twa peoples, but they're about 1%. So the Tutsi people are around, well, historically we're over 10%. Now they're much less than 10%. But the Hutu people were the vast majority, around 85 to 90% of Rwanda. Now, in pre-colonial times, the Tutsi peoples were often identified as like a quasi-aristocracy, right? So they would often be more pastoral. So they would farm animals rather than foodstuffs, and which made them a little wealthier. The ruling classes would typically come from Tutsi populations, but there was always significant overlap. There would be intermarriages between Hutu and Tutsi peoples, for instance. Your neighbor might be a Hutu, but you're a Tutsi. This is before colonialization. So the Germans and the Belgians come in their infinite wisdom, and being sarcastic, by the way.
Yeah,
and
you could say that again.
They decide that, well, Tutsi and Hutu identity, that must function just like it does in Europe. Well, you're either German or you're French or you're Swedish, and that's it. And so what happens, the colonial powers encourage this solidification of ethnic identity into you're a Tutsi and that's that, and you're a Hutu and that's that. And what ends up happening is they kind of use the Tutsi people in a form of indirect rule. And so the Tutsi people are sort of used as a go-between from the colonial administration in Europe to the administration actually in the colony, which unfortunately engendered a lot of resentment amongst Hutu people, right? The reality is that colonialism hurt everyone in Rwanda, but it hurt the Hutu a little more than it hurt the Tutsi. And so years go by, Rwanda gains independence in 1959. And of course, it's a very poor country. Resentment grows, resentment builds. And the genocide was planned, but my thinking actually kind of downplays that. So does that kind of answer your question about like the background of the Rwandan genocide, or would you like a little more detail? Or
yeah, and you know what, I think it, as the volleyball term goes, it sets us up for, you know, further conversation on the matter. So essentially what I'm getting is that there are two main groups that we need to be focusing on, one being the Hutus, focusing more on agriculture, and the others are the Tutsi, who are primarily focusing on livestock. Am I correct in saying that?
That's more of a historical overview. And like today, they don't correspond as neatly to industries like that as they used to.
Okay.
But even still, there is that residue of Hutus identifying Tutsi as almost like they think they're better than us, right?
Okay.
Because historically they were the pastoral people. It's like today they still have the peerage in England, right?
Mm.
Someone can be the, I don't know, the Lord of Westchester, but they don't actually have any power.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, Buddy working at the steel mill is going to look at the Lord of Westchester and say, oh, well, he thinks he's better than me. So you still
Well, he's
have
got
that
a title
leftover.
like Lord.
Yeah.
Do the Tutsi have titles?
Oh, no. There was nothing that strict. No, I'm just trying to give a parallel that might be a little more familiar for some of the listeners in North America.
You made a parallel as well, like how, you know, colonialism made it sort of like, let's look at the European model and just like you have French and Swedish and German. But I'm imagining the French and Swedish and German, I mean, they speak a different language, so there's a big cultural thing there. And then what you described sounded like cultural things as well, like how you do, you know, make your living and get your food. But also, was there an ancestral divide as well? I mean, I'm imagining there's ancestry in France is different than ancestry in Germany.
It's nowhere near as clear cut in the case of Rwanda, because these barriers are semi-permeable. There's a lot of overlap. For instance, they speak the same language. It's the same traditional religion between the two groups. So there's more overlap than there are differences. But colonialism underscored the differences, kind of artificially highlighted the differences and downplayed the similarities.
Do people point at this as like an example of how, like, maybe race is a social construct or something? This sounds like an example of that.
Yeah, it's in my mind, it's one of the best examples of, you know, race and ethnicity as social constructs. But beyond that, it's an excellent example of just how harmful the social construction of ethnicity can be if it's used for malicious purposes.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
So yes, I think we've got a good historical context as to what's going on in Rwanda from it sounds like the early 1900s, all the way up till 1994, where the fan was hit by something not good. So what was the triggering moment that made it happen in such a short period?
Well, there was I'll rewind a little bit to 1990.
Okay.
So what had occurred when the Rwandan Revolution occurred through 1959 through 1960. Now, remember how I had mentioned both the German and Belgian colonial administrations had used Tutsis as sort of like a quasi-aristocracy, sort of a go-between, right? All of this.
What's an aristocracy?
Oh, by aristocracy, that's the wrong word, I suppose. A quasi-elite. Does that make more sense? Yeah.
Yep.
Aristocracy would be the wrong sort of symbolism there. So a quasi-elite. But in 1959 and through 1960, all of this gets flipped on its head. Belgium finally gives its head a shake and says, oh yeah, colonialism is bad. They pull out of Rwanda, and so the Hutu eventually become the dominant ethnicity. And Tutsis are relegated to, say, for example, in post-colonial Rwanda, finding a good job as a civil servant and you were a Tutsi, it's not going to happen. Because now that Rwanda is independent, Hutu have reaffirmed their control of the country. So
and they were you said Hutu made up like 90% of the people.
90%.
And they were at, you know, all that time during like major colonialism, they were like treated as the non-elite,
second class.
And then they switched. They're like, okay, you know, we're going to be elites now.
Then they switch. And so a lot of Tutsi, and there was a endemic violence against Tutsis in this period. And so a lot of Tutsis see this and say, whoa, we're getting out of Rwanda. And so what happens? A refugee culture develops primarily in southern Uganda. And these refugee Tutsis who had formerly lived in Rwanda, in 1987, they formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, now known as the RPF. And they, in 1990, they invade Rwanda from Uganda, being like, okay, we're taking back our ancestral homeland. No more of this Hutu dominance nonsense. So in 1990, the Rwandan Civil War develops. It develops kind of into a stalemate. There's a truce in 1993, a very uneasy truce. So that lasts for about a year. And in April 1994, the president's personal airplane is shot down. Now, even today, I am inclined to say that the RPF shot down the plane, but there are some scholars that argue that actually elements of the Hutu-dominated government shot down the plane to make an excuse to ignite a genocide. But that's kind of beside the point. So this occurs, and the Rwandan government just almost like overnight sets up checkpoints. It sets up roadblocks. And here's the problem. In Rwanda, you would have government-issued identification that would say if you're Hutu or Tutsi. So if you stop at a roadblock and they ask you for ID and you're Tutsi, well, yeah, that was the end of your story, and you were murdered. And it's remarkable because a lot of scholars will look and they place the Rwandan state, the state as foremost in explaining the genocide, because the genocide was organized by the state. The genocide was committed by paramilitary groups that were instituted by the state. But I have a somewhat different interpretation in that I think a lot of this was actually unplanned. That makes me different from a lot of the literature in this subject. So did you guys want to go into like my own sort of interpretation of the genocide, or take this in a different direction?
Yeah, you know what, I would love to pick up on that. So just to clarify, so the president's plane that was shot down, he was a Hutu. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, you are correct.
Yeah. So he's a Hutu, and the Hutus of Rwanda have seen that not only the leader of their country has been killed, but the leader of their group has been killed, essentially.
Yeah.
So, like, is this a crystallization thing going on? Is the effect immediate, or does it take time to develop?
Excellent question, Liam. And the reason why I think that's excellent is because that hits on a point, sort of a real salient point in the literature of, was this a concretely planned in advance genocide, or should we look at more contingent factors to explain the genocide? And by contingent factors, I sort of mean just occurrences that just sort of randomly happen that nevertheless generate a violent response.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually take a bit of a mix of both. I think it's, I don't think it's possible to separate the genocide from this idea of it being planned, because I mean, empirically, and when I say empirically, I mean like evidence that we can see with our own eyes. So empirically, we know that there were checkpoints, that there were roadblocks, that there were organized gangs, that there were paramilitary groups. There must be a high involvement of the state. Mm-hmm. But I actually take a more contingent explanation. Do you remember how I was explaining a lot of the overlap between Tutsi and Hutu? That's where I center my analysis. So what I argue, I argue that it's precisely because the categories of Tutsi and Hutu are very poorly defined that those the idea of those ethnicities were manipulated by the state. So because there was so much overlap, and there was so much, so much uncertainty about, like, well, if I'm Tutsi, but my neighbors are Hutu, and my friends are Hutu, but but maybe my father-in-law is Tutsi, et cetera, et cetera. It's just like, well, what exactly is Tutsi identity? Now that's the role of the state in all of this, in manipulating the idea of what Tutsi ethnicity is, essentially from different than you, but they're just your neighbor, to an active threat. And what they did, the Hutu state, it planned the genocide, but it planned the genocide in more non-material terms, in more encouraging Hutus to view Tutsi ethnicity as threatening. And so, of course, all of this is happening in the context of the civil war fought against the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And a lot of Tutsi civilians were linked as somehow supporters of the RPF, as if they were the enemy on the home front. So because the RPF was a Tutsi organization, the Hutu state could manipulate the idea of ethnicity to say, well, if there's Tutsi soldiers fighting against us, the Tutsi civilians, well, they must be aiding the enemy. And if they're aiding the enemy, that makes them the enemy. And if they're the enemy, then it's acceptable to kill them. Not only acceptable, but it's your civic duty. And that's sort of where I center my analysis, is on the messiness of ethnicity as an analytical category.
So you'd said that one of your main questions about this is what drives someone to violence. So is what you've now sort of not concluded, but come to an understanding of is the motivation to commit violence is a political in nature. You look at, if you're a political person, you can be driven to violence if you feel it's your duty to your ethnicity and your country.
That's definitely part of it. That's like the justification of it. If you ask, say you're sitting down with someone who'd committed genocide and having a beer with them or whatever, and you say, well, how do you justify your actions? That would be the justification. Okay. But I think that's only half the story. I think the other half of the story is motivation. And so when we try to create concrete ethnic groups, which Tutsi and Hutu, as I've highlighted, were not concrete, a ton of overlap. When we create these concrete ethnic identities, we sort of create an extension of someone's personal life. So it's not just that it's a threat against, say for example, I'm a New Brunswicker. Say for example, if there was a genocide being committed against New Brunswickers, and even though I'm in Ontario, I would think, oh my God, like, it'd be as if, imagine if someone attacked a sibling. They're not attacking you, but it's as if they're attacking you. They might as well be attacking you because they're attacking someone who is integral to your personal identity. Does that make sense? So
well, it sounds like it depends how closely affiliated you feel to the group being attacked. If someone said they are attacking humans, I mean, we don't have enough humanists on the planet for enough humans to say, hey, I'm pissed that humans are being attacked. Otherwise, everyone would be up in arms about all the atrocities happening all over the planet, and they're not. But then when it comes to even, let's say, Canada, there's a lot of people in Canada, but some people will be like, hey, I'm personally offended that you're targeting Canadians because I'm Canadian. Whereas you get even closer and closer, and when you get down to like as close as your sibling, then it's clearly personal. I don't know anyone who wouldn't be offended by you attacking a sibling.
Of course. And I think linking this, all of this required, now when I say this, I'm not endorsing what was done by any means, but all of it required some plausibility. So because you had a Tutsi rebel group in open conflict with government forces, it gave it that sort of plausibility. They could say, well, maybe maybe there's a connection between Tutsi civilians and the military RPF. Well, it's similar to think about Japanese internment in Canada. The Second World War, obviously, that was a moronic policy, racist, should not have been done. But because Canada was at war with Japan, that gave it some official plausibility. It sort of, it gave, it's like you take an initial fact, but then you link it to 100 different myths. So even though everything else is a myth, you have that core of plausibility, if that makes sense. So I think we have to think about genocide in contextual terms as, well, there's a reason why you often see war correlated with genocide. And it's just that reason, because it creates this plausibility, this narrative of a threat. You see the Armenian genocide during World War I, the Holocaust during World War II, and the Rwandan genocide during that country's civil war. I hope that, I think that sort of illustrates an answer to your question.
You know, I think you've given us a really good idea about what happened and some of the factors that went into why it happened.
Yeah.
Could you tell us just briefly, how are you going about studying this? Where are you getting this information? What's your day-to-day look like in this program?
Well, that's the kicker, because of COVID, initially I was going to travel for field research to conduct interviews with veterans of the RPF, was actually the angle I was going to take of studying the genocide. But because travel is unlikely to be an option, I'll be doing archival research, and that's where my comparative training will come in.
Okay.
So what I'll do is I'll use access to another case. Say if I have access to archival sources, I'll use that to bolster my arguments, because I just don't have access to certain sources anymore, because Uganda is a poor country with limited healthcare resources. Their border is going to be shut for the foreseeable future. And I don't blame them. I mean, it's kind of sucks for me, but I'll be using archival research, and I'll be using the comparative method to kind of try to fill in the gaps that unfortunately coronavirus is creating for all researchers around the world. And I'm sure I'm not the first grad student at Western to have this problem. That's for sure.
Well, we wish you the best. I think that we're getting pretty close to the end here. So we're going to have to wrap it up. If you had to give any advice for someone who wanted to study something like you're studying, what advice would you give? Let's say COVID aside, if someone was just generally interested in the field you're doing, what advice would you give to all those chip factory workers at the moment? What advice would you give?
So if someone wants to get into the study of genocide, I would say, I personally think, at least for me, what was a real light bulb moment is when I developed my own sort of theoretical thinking on the subject. And what I mean by theoretical is there's this idea that genocide will occur if these conditions X, Y, and Z are met. And I think it's important to develop a theoretical conception prior to your study of it, because if you don't have a strong theory background, you'll just be looking at different sources with nothing to guide you. So anyone coming into a poli-sci, PhD, or a master's program, theory. Start with theory. That's where everything begins. It's the foundation upon which your dissertation will be built. So when you're falling asleep in your mandatory theory classes, for God's sakes, pay attention.
Okay. Well, I think that's great advice. That's a good note to leave on. And I think you've demonstrated your knowledge of theory excellently, and look forward to hearing more about where you take this project and how you write it out. Thanks for coming on the show.
Great. Well, thank you for having me.
This has been GradCast, the official radio show and podcast of the Society of Graduate Students at Western University. I've been your host, Ariel, and my co-host was Liam Clifford. We've been speaking with John Trafford, And this episode was produced by Gavin Tolometti. If you'd like to be involved with the show, get in contact with us. Email us at gradcastradio@gmail.com. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Social media is pretty hot nowadays. At Gradcast Radio. To listen to us, our archived episodes are available on our website, gradcast.ca. We are on the radio at CHRW 94.9 FM and any podcast app you find, like Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, where all our episodes are available there. Alternatively, we have certain episodes uploaded to YouTube in video format. You can find them there at Gradcast Radio. Thanks for listening. Have a great night.